Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Paul Booth, a professor at DuPaul University who has edited several books on fans and fandom. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, good to have you. Well, let's start with what we mean by fans and fandom. Some people maybe watch a show continually and consider themselves fans. Other people watch the show just as much and don't consider themselves fans. What's the difference there?
That's a great question, and I feel like I've spent my entire academic career trying to get to the bottom of this question. You know, what makes a fan a fan? And I think there's a couple of things. You know, on the one hand, it's a very self-professed identity. Saying that you're a fan is saying something about how you want to be identified. If you are a fan of the Beatles and you say, I'm a fan of the Beatles, you're saying something about who you are and about your personality. But I think it's also about that dumb part of it, the fandom, right? You're saying that you're part of a community, you're part of a group of people that enjoys the TV show or the movie or the music.
Okay, well, now I know that you've focused a lot of your work, your research and scholarship on the Doctor Who narrative, essentially, and that's a really good one to focus on because I think there's lots of interesting things there that can be explored. Obviously,
it's so rich and deep as a fandom.
Yeah. So I mean, tell us about what attracts you to that from a scholarly standpoint.
Well, what's the old adage? You know, I study the thing that made me who I am, right?
Yeah.
Because I am a Doctor Who fan, and I was before I was an academic. But you know, to me, I started studying fandom, and then I realized I was studying fandom because I was a fan, and I wanted to get to the bottom of some of why I did the things that I did, and that led me to Doctor Who, which is just a perfect example of studying fan audiences because it's such a long-lived text. I mean, it's been on the air for almost 60 years.
Yeah, I think their first episode was right after the Kennedy assassination, right? And and they didn't start it on time because they were still covering the assassination, right?
Yeah, correct. And they also did something unprecedented at the time, which was show it on a repeat. They never used to repeat, but the BBC figured we'd lost a huge amount of the audience because they were watching the news. So let's repeat that episode, and they had a much higher audience, so it did help.
Okay, so it's one of the longest running television things of all time. And what else? What else is?
Well, and it charts so many different types of fan activities. You know, since it starts in a very pre-digital age, so you have a lot of fan activity that's very in person. You have some of the earliest fan clubs are started certainly in the 70s, but even a little earlier than that in the late 60s. There's an international element to it because, of course, it's the BBC, and so it gets spread to all the former colonies. And in fact, a lot of
the colonies. That's funny.
Well, exactly. I mean, there was still a kind of relationship, even though they were no longer politically linked. And so you have this kind of really a fascinating collection of episodes that the BBC actually lost or got rid of, but were held in other countries. They found episodes in Nigeria, they found episodes in Hong Kong.
No kidding.
Because those were where they were very, very popular, and then the BBC buys them back so they can package them up and sell them to the fans.
That's interesting. Well, and it just occurs to me, maybe we should, like, for people who aren't as familiar with Doctor Who, maybe we should kind of outline what we're talking about.
Sure.
Here. So the show is about someone who's a humanoid alien, I think is described as, right? Yeah. And he has a time travel machine that looks like a phone booth.
Yes.
And he travels around the universe and through time in this, and carries copies of the Mona Lisa with him, and and bizarre things like that, right? He takes Van Gogh.
He takes Van Gogh
to the Musée
d'Orsay,
yeah, to see his paintings hanging and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly right. And importantly, the Doctor is an adventurer, and they're a curious. They're a doctor, not a military person, right? They're not a general or something, and so they're out to explore the universe, and they wrong the rights, or they right the wrongs rather, that happen in the universe. So there is a kind of moral imperative to what the Doctor is doing.
And it started, as you said, around 1963, I guess, right?
November 23rd.
Yeah, November, and most of us in America were exposed to it in the 70s when it was running on PBS.
In the history of Doctor Who, being in the Chicago area is fabulous because there's so many connections.
Yeah.
And famously, the 20th anniversary episode that came out in 1983 aired in Chicago first, before in the UK. Yeah.
We love you in Chicago.
Exactly.
Dr. Who,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Somehow we ended up with that copy of it, and we showed it 2 days early.
Yeah. So another thing that interests me about this, because it's been so long lasting, obviously there's something in there that registers with people on a level that goes beyond what's happening today, right?
Yeah.
Do you associate Doctor Who with any literary characters? I mean, the first association I have is with Ulysses.
Yeah.
Right.
It's funny you mentioned that. There's a whole book about. There was a Doctor Who movie that came out, a TV movie.
Yeah.
And the original writer of that based that movie on the story of Ulysses.
Yeah, because he takes 10 years coming back from Troy to get home, and he stops in all these different places. He's exposed to all these different cultures. Uses his wits to get out of things, much the way Doctor Who does, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a character that is archetypical, right?
Yeah.
He's also a trickster, and they're also very curious, and they're also very adventurous, but brave. I think because the Doctor can change their face, right? And so we've had 13 actors and actresses playing the role, and each one brings something different to it. So.
Right.
There's people always ask, Paul, who's your favorite Doctor? You've studied Doctor Who. And I'm like, it depends on who I want to be at that particular moment, because each Doctor can represent something different.
Yeah.
Each one brings a different flavor to the role.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that struck me as odd about this is that, I really loved these shows in the 70s, as did a lot of other people. But I remember, watching one day and I realized that they were just running through some tunnel that was a bunch of cardboard boxes that they assembled in a studio probably. And then, 10 minutes later, they were running through that tunnel again, and they killed another 5 minutes. And then later on in the show, they were running through that tunnel. And then I was watching the next week, and they were running through the same tunnel again. And it just seemed like it really had low production values.
Yeah.
And a lot of, repetition, almost like you watch movies now, and there's these wasted time, watching car chases that really have no meaning, right? So if it was that popular and the production values were so low, right? Does that say something about our level of interest in the concept of science fiction and time travel and the things that challenge us intellectually?
Yeah,
because we didn't care what it looked like.
We didn't care what it looked like.
Yeah.
And I found this in teaching the class. I show classic episodes to my students, and of course we laugh at the cheap sets and then the bad special effects.
Yeah.
But what is central and what is at the heart of these episodes is this very, very interesting, detailed, complete story world. And it's compelling.
Yeah.
And there is something about following this character and knowing that they've been on the air for this long, I think when it first started, there was a little bit more definition to the show. There was a historical episode and a science fiction episode, and they kind of went back and forth like that. But now it's completely open, and they can really do anything. And part of the fun is, what are they going to do? What are they going to come up with next?
Yeah. And I see that, but I mean, do you think there's also just a part of it, just an intellectual attraction there, because it's going to expose you to new ideas? And if you, if you say you're a fan of this show, you're kind of telling people, I like to contemplate the fate of the universe. And
I mean, then that gets back to what we're talking about with fans, right? Like that we take an aspect of the thing that we're a fan of as part of our identity. So if I say, I'm a Doctor Who fan, I study Doctor Who, people are going to understand something about me in the way that Doctor Who is understood in our culture. It's quirky, it's weird, but it is also an intellectual exercise.
Well, so what does this have to do with people's identity? If someone says they're a fan of a particular show, do they understand that they're defining themselves? Are they intending to define who they are by making that association, do you think?
I think some people probably do. I think there are people that hold a fandom so closely to themselves that it becomes how they identify, and it becomes that crutch in some ways, or that sign of who they are. But I think in other ways it's unintentional, and I always think about, if I go to someone's house for dinner, one of the first things that I do is I look at their bookshelf. and I'm scanning their books.
Right.
What are they reading? What sort
Right.
of things are they interested
I
in?
do that when I'm watching movies. I try to see what books are on
Look
the
in the
shelves.
background.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
the zooming over the past 18 months with people in their homes, how many of us looked in the backgrounds to say like, well, how,
I did do that. Sure.
all the time.
I mean, it's almost like you're reading their mind.
Yeah.
Right? Because you see all of their intellectual influences there and things
Absolutely.
like that.
And I think it's the same with fandom. The things we associate ourselves with tell people about who we are.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's explore you now. So you say you're a fan. What are your favorite episodes?
Oh my goodness!
Yeah.
This is the worst question you could possibly ask. I'm a big fan of weird episodes of Doctor Who.
Okay.
I've seen every episode multiple times, so I have lots of thoughts. But there's this episode from the 70s called Day of the Daleks, which is a time travel episode, and they introduce this weird paradox that they never resolve, and that is really interesting to me.
This sounds familiar to me. Go ahead.
So there's a peace conference, and the Daleks, who are the mortal enemy of the Doctor, are going to try and disrupt the peace conference. But in doing so, they actually cause it to happen, and it was just like, I remember when I saw it as a kid, it blew my mind. That may be why I study this whole thing, right?
It was in other words, they created what's called a time paradox in some of the other.
Yeah, I love time
movies.
paradox stuff. In new Doctor Who, there's an episode, actually it's also kind of a time paradox episode, where the Doctor is running around this old castle and being chased by this monster, and it's just him, and he has to kind of survive with his wits, but it's all a time travel thing. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you really explore that, I mean, what is it about time travel? Is it that it teases you, that it...
It's a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
I think it's the same reason I really like board games and escape rooms and things, like I like the feeling of satisfaction of solving something, of thinking that I'm clever. I mean, I am a professor, so
right. Yeah, you have credentials.
Kind of
have
to put that out there. But at the same time, it gives, to me, there's always something to talk about, because it never quite fits together quite right. So it always invites conversation. And what I love more than anything is doing this, coming and talking about this thing that I love in a kind of thoughtful, intellectual way.
There's also, I think, and this is probably more true in England than it is in the United States, but there's also sort of some interaction, some participation with fans. England's obviously a smaller country. I remember going to a play in Oxford, which is sort of an off-Broadway for London, and the director of the play was standing outside talking on his, on a phone or something, because you could just run into people there.
Yeah.
Because it's so small. So what interaction has happened here? Do fans get involved in the selection of the next Doctor Who? And
yeah, that's really interesting. So every time a new Doctor is announced, or they announce that a Doctor is leaving, there's rampant speculation, and the press gets involved, the betting agents get involved, and the last Doctor...
They give odds on who's
going to be the next Doctor.
There have been 13?
Yeah, we're on the 13th Doctor at the moment, and she's leaving at the end of this year, so we'll have a new one soon. But what's also interesting is because it's such a long-lived text, the fans that were watching the show in the 70s are the ones who are making it now. So the producers of Doctor Who in the 2000s, Russell T Davies, Stephen Moffat, and Chris Chibnall, were all fans of Doctor Who in the 70s and 80s, and they've brought that fandom with them. So you've seen a lot of returning characters, of returning monsters, but also just some themes and some little kind of Easter eggs that pop up every once in a while. Yeah,
so that they're really, the distinction is gone almost. The fans are almost part of the
they've become part
of the entity, right?
The fans have become the gatekeepers in some ways. Yeah.
So I imagine that there have been attempts to track this. Who's the most popular Doctor Who, and what do they like about it?
Obviously, there are tons and tons of polls. And every time you meet a Doctor Who fan, is who's your favorite Doctor? The two Doctors that almost consistently lead the polls. Tom Baker, who was the fourth Doctor.
He's the one I saw in the 70s.
The one with the scarf.
Yeah.
He's been in The Simpsons. Like, that's how big Tom Baker is, right?
He made The Simpsons. Wow.
Still
There's an important
iconic,
show,
and David Tennant, new Doctor, is also very popular. But what's interesting, I teach a class on Doctor Who, and I've been teaching it since 2014. And every year, the students, when I ask, who's your favorite Doctor, it's a lot of David Tennant's, it's a lot of Tom Baker's, but then I'm getting more and more Matt Smith's in there. And I think it's because a lot of people's favorite Doctors are the ones that they first see. And the students now who are 18, 19, 20 started watching Doctor Who on Netflix in 2013.
Yeah.
And that Doctor was Matt Smith.
Yeah, interesting. There was a seminal essay written about rhetoric. I know you're also a rhetoric student. Was it maybe Witchlands or something? This is like pre-World War II, I think. And he made the argument that, anyway, whoever made it, the argument was this, that in studying speeches, we're not just studying what the speaker said and what the speaker thought, but we're also studying what, kind of the history of the time, because speeches are always given in response to things that are going on around them. And so by studying the speech, you can actually study something beyond the speech. And it was an important step, I think, in rhetoric. Do you think we can make that argument about something like Doctor Who, because they've changed the Doctor so many times? Does that reflect changes in the attitudes of the public?
That's 100% what my class is about, Tom. This is great.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, you can chart changing culture by how Doctor Who changes over 60 years.
Yeah.
And in the 70s, there's episodes of Doctor Who that deal with feminism, that deal with environmentalism and the emerging green culture at the time. There's episodes that deal directly with political things that are happening. So in the 1970s, there was a famous miners' strike in the UK where all the miners went on strike. And there's an episode where that happens on an alien planet, and they solve the problem.
Yeah.
In the 80s, there's a very, very clear Margaret Thatcher character that emerges that is just a complete shambles. The Doctor Who staff were all very left-wing, very avant-garde creators at that time, and so they're creating.
They trashed poor Margaret Thatcher.
They trashed poor Maggie.
Yeah.
And then even in the 2000s and today, we're getting episodes about climate change, about diversity and the importance of valuing others.
Yeah.
The episodes reflect the concerns of the contemporary moment.
What about that distinction, though? I mean, are there some, are there categories here where there are some things that it's like it's positive to say you're a fan of this, it's negative to say you're a fan of that, or it's neutral? I mean, have you noticed that kind of a spread?
Yeah, I mean, in contemporary culture generally, no one will look at you askance if you say that you're a sports fan, right? Of pretty much any sport. There's something, sports is masculine, or coded masculine, sports is coded as realistic, and we reward sports figures, quite highly. I think if you move down into media fandom, music fandom, celebrity fandom, it tends to be a bit more looked down upon. And there's a great example I always give my students. When I look at my cable bill, I'm paying, I don't know, $5, $7 a month for the support of the Chicago Cubs, and I've never really watched a game. I don't really care. It's not my thing. But I'm paying for that, right? And that's okay. That's the world we live in. We all support sports. But if there was a Star Trek fee, we're all paying $5 so that Star Trek, we have a Star Trek channel, I think people would be up in arms about it.
I don't know if there is a Star Trek channel, but there probably could be one, given all the movies and the.
If there was, I'd be the first to subscribe to it.
Yeah. Well, so we think of fans in sports and in music and in movies, right? Fans of movies, fans of movie stars, fans of celebrities. We don't really call people who support politicians fans, though, do we?
We don't most of the time, but I think there are subsets of politicians' followers that certainly act like fans, even if we don't call them fans. So, I think during the 2016 election, Trump had a lot of supporters that were doing fan-type activities. Bernie Sanders certainly had huge fandom of people that were following him. And even today, you've got Bernie Sanders memes, right, which come out and are kind of just fan-generated.
They're fascinating, I know. Well, but normally we don't associate that with politics, which is kind of interesting because, part of the pejorative nature of fans and fandom is that, it doesn't really represent anything. Star Trek doesn't mean anything. There's no I think most people would say anyway, there's no philosophy there that you're necessarily attaching yourself to,
Well,
right?
I think I'm going to respectfully disagree there because
All right.
I think Star Trek certainly does have a deeply held philosophy for the fans.
About inclusivity,
And the power of
open-mindedness,
and respect.
Yeah, maybe that's a bad example, but okay, saying I'm a Britney Spears fan, then how much of the audience am I alienating? I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but I don't know
But
that.
at the moment, you're totally fine because it's all hashtag Free Britney.
Yeah. So I just don't know that. I think that some things that being a fan just means you're a consumer.
Yeah.
And in some cases, saying you're a fan means that you're ascribing to some similar belief systems and things like that. And I would think that would apply to politicians more than to anything, right? I mean, if you're, if you were a fan of JFK, you could certainly cite things that he said and did that you identify with, but yet we don't look at it. With the exception of Donald Trump, who was already a celebrity before he ran for president, right?
And I wonder if part of that is because the term fan is so related to media and sport, these kind of created worlds, and we look at our politicians as real people, even though they are kind of celebrities in the same way that movie stars are celebrities. We don't know who the real Bernie Sanders is. We have the Bernie Sanders persona.
Right.
So fan, I would say fan is a completely appropriate term to use.
Yeah.
But you're right that we don't normally ascribe that to politicians.
Yet it's a very similar kind of relationship.
Absolutely,
isn't it?
very similar relationship.
Yeah. Well, so just lastly, if we look at the negative side of this, to what extent are fandoms cult-like? How are they? What do they have in common with in the negative sense? What we mean by cult?
This is a great question, and I think it has to do with cultural connotations. A cult is a group of people who believe something that's so off the mainstream. By we, I mean mainstream culture looks down on them.
Yeah, they're actually creating a crisis for themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
If a cult gets big enough, it's no longer a cult. It's just what people believe.
Right. We call it a political party at that point.
Or a religion.
Yeah.
Fandom, I think, is the same in that respect. Very, very small, very deliberate fandom is maybe looked at in a very peculiar way, but if it gets larger and larger, it's no longer that weird to say, I'm a fan of Marvel.
Right. Yeah, if I say I'm a fan of the Walking Dead, for instance, right, what is that saying about me?
Right, well, it's partly how you're identifying, right?
Yeah.
But it's also how culture would view the text that you're a fan of.
Sure.
If I said that I'm a fan of the Beatles, we don't think that's weird because we revere the Beatles. They're the #1 band of all time.
Right.
But if I said
unless you're a Stones fan.
Unless you're,
but
well, let's
go ahead,
not get into that.
Yeah.
But then, if I said I was a fan of Twilight or I was a fan of 50 Shades of Grey, those are kind of culturally devalued texts. And so we think because the text is devalued, the person that's a fan of them is also devalued.
Yeah. But isn't there also a bit of a pejorative sense to just fan at all? Because part of what it conjures up is a kind of mindless following of something, almost a cult-like attraction to something, right?
Yeah, we do. We have this kind of cultural conception that fans are these crazed lunatics who can't tell the difference between reality and fiction, and we have
some of them maybe are.
Well, some are, but there are plenty of people who aren't fans who
right.
are also crazed people who can't tell
Good
the difference.
point. Yeah, good point.
And I think we see that reinforced a lot as well. So movies will come out or TV shows will come out that depict a fan, and the fan is crazy or the fan is weird in some way.
Yeah, if you think of how they're depicted in films, right? They usually end up shooting somebody at the end of the movie, right?
Yeah, and it creates it's very dramatic. It creates a very dramatic moment. But then we watch that movie and we think, well, that's all fans, and it really isn't. And fans just get this kind of pejorative sense to the title, and that may also be why people are a little bit reluctant to take it on for themselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and with some things, there's no pejorative sense at all. Like, I think, people are perfectly happy to say they're Star Trek fans if they're Star Trek fans. It's kind of a way of bonding with a stranger.
I think it depends on the context, though, right?
You think?
Like, I think if you and I were at a convention or we were hanging out with maybe NASA folks, saying you're a Star Trek fan is totally fine. But if I was hanging out with a group of, I don't know, Packers fans, and it's game day, and I come in and say, all right, let's turn on the Star Trek episode that's on right now, I think I'd get a different reaction.
Right, right. But you know, I think there's certainly a pejorative element to saying you're a Green Bay fan, but you know that's another area we won't get into.
We can bring that up with any, you know.
There's
any
a Chicago area show.
There's a
here.
Chicago area show.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Paul Booth for joining us today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.